Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Goodsall. I'm the New South Wales head of the Australian Industry Group, and it's my pleasure to be the MC for this webinar this morning on what's next for business. It's pretty clear we're entering a sort of inflection point or a new phase in the pandemic response in Australia and in each of the states. So it's timely for us to consider two things, we think, in this morning's presentation. Firstly, how are people operating? How are companies operating at this sort of maximum lockdown level, which we've had for a couple of weeks now? It's clear we're not. There's not a political intention to take lockdowns further, although that always remains an option. And all the talk now at the state level and nationally is about easing restrictions and doing what we can to open up the economy, always consistent with the health outcomes. So the two topics we'd like to talk about today is how are companies operating, what have we learnt about operating at this maximum lockout level, and importantly, what do we do, how do we prepare for the easing of restrictions that will have both social effects but also business effects as things open up. So that's the agenda for today. And just to cover off some housekeeping issues before we move on. In this technology, if you've got questions to ask the speakers, and we'll try and get to questions at the end of the presentation to either of our speakers, please use the Q&A tab. The chat option has been disabled, so just put your questions in through the Q&A tab. If we don't get to your questions in the presentation, then we'll endeavour to contact you afterwards to give you an answer. And a copy of the presentation will be available as soon as we can get it up, and certainly within 24 hours. So moving on to what I'd like to cover today, and the next slide will show that there's 5 issues really, and when we ran a similar webinar to this at the beginning of the pandemic in mid-March, we adopted a similar structure for work health and safety, that there were 4 key issues, and today we're integrating the employment and workplace relations impacts that come out of those work health and safety issues. My colleagues Tracy Brown and Michael Mead will cover the technical detail of these issues. Tracy heads our work health and safety and workers' comp policy effort nationally in AI Group, and Michael Mead leads our workplace relations and legal services team. What I'd like to do is just cover off a couple of sort of high-level issues that come from this structure of issues. The first thing to remind everyone is we're dealing with both a health, still dealing with both a health and an economic crisis in this pandemic response, and the governments, both levels of government, make it clear that the health issue is what they're needing to deal with, and the economic stuff is secondary. But there's clearly a change in the rhetoric at the moment, where there's a lot more interest in seeing how much economic activity we can get going. If we just go back to the previous slide, if we just so the health issue is still trumps everything. But what we've saw is when we went into the kind of lockdowns that we've had, everybody was rushing around, sort of trying to learn as much as they can, and to a great degree, including government, we were making it up as we went, and there was a bit of leeway given to how companies were allowed to respond and could work out how to respond. As we go into this next phase and start talking about easing restrictions, there will be an expectation that companies in particular have got their act together and understand how to operate their businesses in a COVID-safe manner. And that's starting to be made even more explicit now. And the most important expression of that is last Friday, the national government and the states jointly released the National Safe Workplace Principles, which set out very high-level standards that workplaces are expected to adhere to. either if they're opening up for the first time since they've started, or they're expanding, or if they've operated the whole time, there's a much more explicit expectation now that we'll all have our act together as workplaces and as businesses in managing the health issues, even as we're trying to restore the economic activity. So that's really the primary issue under that. There is a other issue now that's emerged in the last few days of the federal government's COVID Safe app. That's also one of their key levers in managing the infection control rates. And so workplaces are seen as reasonably safe places because they're everyone knows each other, so contact tracing is easy. What they're really worried about, of course, is random interactions between people in the community where you're not sure who you've had close contact with, you don't know their name, and that's still what they're watching, and that's what the app is designed to do. You can't force any person, you can't compel anybody, including employees, to download the app. It's obviously in the interest of it working that as many people download it as possible. But it's up to each business to work out the best interaction. Probably the most important thing a leader of a workplace can say is that they've downloaded the app, because it really is still a personal choice, and there are still residual concerns, whether real or imagined, about security, and businesses probably may not want to get involved in those kind of concerns. But certainly leaders of organisations saying that they've downloaded the app is a good starting point. The other issues that we'll cover today that have been apparent as the areas of interest in work health and safety in the pandemic have been: how are we working from home? How's that going? Have we got our act together there? And importantly, the issue about how do you reintegrate people back into their normal workplace when they've been working at home for a while. We'll cover that issue today. Mental health is still a major concern. A lot of what you're seeing from governments, the state governments in particular, about starting to open up things like beaches and family visits to greater range of interaction, are directly aimed at improving community mental health. There's very great concern that even the lockdown that we've had thus far has had some significant mental health effects. And the thing about mental health is the experts will say that 80% of the outcomes or the reactions to that kind of traumatic situation don't occur until months or even years after the event. So we shouldn't think that the mental health and anxiety that we've seen so far is the extent of what will be produced by this pandemic. There have been issues about workers' comp. From day one in this exercise, we're very concerned that the workers' comp schemes were able to survive the pandemic because they're fairly fragile things at the best of times, and there are real issues about premium calculation in this kind of economic downturn, about claims profiles in this kind of environment where a lot of people are working from home and with mental health issues. And more recently, the interaction with the JobKeeper scheme. So we'll deal with those issues in the presentation today and hopefully answer your questions to the extent that we do have those answers. And finally, a lot of the work health and safety issues overlap and lead directly into employment workplace relations impacts, and we will attempt to deal with those with Michael's involvement later on. So if I just finally move on to a graph of the ABS has recently produced a survey of how firms have responded. And this is a bit of a window into what actually has been going on out there under the pressure of COVID-19. And this is a range of not just work health and safety responses, but business responses. But what it tells us is there's been significant change in workplaces. It's probably the bleeding obvious at the moment, but it still serves well to see it in hard evidence through this survey. A lot of change in workplaces through new rules and procedures, reduced staff hours, a lot of working from home, as we know, A lot of companies have suddenly had to become experts in infection control. And so there's been a lot of things going on in workplaces, a lot of good things. But as I said earlier, companies have been searching for answers about what is the right thing to do. And those answers sometimes have been hard to find because government has been having to develop a pandemic response as we go. The next slide actually shows the other side of the coin and what employees have been thinking about this. And you can take it on face value, ACTU research, but it probably is valuable to note that the employees and the unions are watching how companies respond. And of course, this is research that's across the whole of the economy, including those significant parts of the economy that have high levels of casuals and have been really significantly affected by the pandemic, or have high levels of customer and public interaction, which is not typical of the industrial sector, but is typical of those sectors that closed down or were affected very early. So it's useful to remember, and I'll finish on this point, that what companies are doing is being watched. And so if you are doing things, if your response is thought through, then make sure you're consulting with your employees and, if necessary, their unions, so they know why you're doing things. And if you're not doing things, if you don't see the sense and your advice is there's no sense in supplying things like masks, then make sure people know why that's not being done, because as this survey suggests, people still have questions about what is the right thing to do. With that overview, I may now hand on to Tracy to handle the work health and safety. Tracy.
Thanks, Mark. What I want to start with, just moving on to the next slide, is some of the key workers' compensation issues that have arisen. We can deal with those quickly and then move on to the health and safety issues. So the sorts of questions that came up at the start of this process was, how would claims be considered if somebody contracted COVID-19? And if they were at work, did it mean that they would end up with a workers' compensation claim being accepted? All of those considerations are being looked at in exactly the same way as they would for any other work-related compensation claim. Did the infection arise out of or in the course of employment? So there are some workplaces where that will be relatively easy to identify, like the health industry. In manufacturing, warehousing, all those sorts of workplaces where we're not getting interaction with the general public, unless there is a COVID infection within your workplace, the chances of there being an accepted workers' compensation claim is going to be relatively low. What we have had in some jurisdictions is South Australia and New South Wales, there have been non-government bills put into Parliament trying to change the burden of proof for COVID cases to a presumptive legislation approach. Simply what that means is that if somebody has a COVID-19 confirmed case, then it would be automatically accepted as a workers' compensation claim unless the employer could demonstrate that the exposure wasn't in that workplace. Now, where that presumptive legislation has been put into Parliament, it has picked out a list of occupations. So it's things like health, supermarkets, the sort of people that have that contact where it can't be identified necessarily who they've had contact with. To date, neither of those bills have progressed, and I think the pressure for that is probably going to have reduced significantly now that we're at a level where the cases haven't ended up at the sort of numbers that we thought might occur at the start of the COVID space. But we will keep an eye on what's happening in that area. All of the jurisdictions are providing different ways of providing data around what's happening with their claims. Through meetings that we're involved in with Safe Work Australia, we're getting fortnightly briefings around what sort of claims numbers are coming up. Some jurisdictions are telling us more than others. The numbers are relatively low, but I did want to refer briefly to some statistics that are being presented on the CIRA website in New South Wales. So CIRA is the workers' compensation regulator, and they've been providing daily updates of data, and some of you may have seen in some of the social media coverage announcements of 150 claims having been lodged in New South Wales. That was about a week and a half ago that press coverage occurred. One of the challenges we've got with the data that Sarah's presenting is it's actually notifications and claims. And for those of you that operate in New South Wales, you'd be aware that employers have an obligation to advise their insurer of any injury in the workplace that may become a claim. And so when we look at the data on the CIRA website, and as of yesterday, it was 197 notifications and claims, only 10 of those were claims related to a confirmed COVID case. And of the total 197 notifications and claims, 106 of them were for exposures. So it's where an employer, I think, has been very conservative and said, we're aware of an exposure, so we want to notify. And also, of the 197, 152 of them were notifications. So it's not a big amount of claims as it might look when you just look at the data as a raw data. But one of the things that you will see if you look at that data, and is coming through in the other jurisdictions as well, is claims for mental health injuries for COVID as well. And on the CIRA statistics, it's 42 total claims and notifications in relation to a confirmed case of COVID, and 35 combined of notifications and claims for a mental disorder associated with COVID. So it's definitely something that we're really starting to see signs that that's potentially going to be one of our biggest workers' comp issues. Moving on to JobKeeper payments on the next slide, and what we know about that at the moment, and it is something that is still being unpacked. What we know from the Commonwealth legislation is that if a worker is fully incapacitated and receiving weekly compensation, they're not entitled to JobKeeper payments and employers can't claim them. However, the guidance on both the ATO website and on the legislation website says that if a person is working even on reduced hours, JobKeeper payments will apply. Now, what we need from individual jurisdictions is how are they going to look at that in relation to reimbursements that you might receive for compensation, and also how that's going to be treated in relation to a new claim where JobKeeper payments is part of the person's normal weekly earnings. And jurisdictions are still trying to work out exactly what that means. Some have put some information up on their websites, and others are still working through it. The other area of concern is how JobKeeper payments are going to impact on premium. And we have a simple view that if a person is going to be paid more because of JobKeeper than they would have been under normal COVID circumstances, so either their normal pay or if they've been stood down, no pay, an employer shouldn't have extra on-costs associated with JobKeeper, such as payroll tax and workers' compensation. So once again, we're waiting for answers from the jurisdictions in relation to premium. For most people, they're not going to be concerned about actually declaring remuneration until we get to late June, early July, maybe even into August, so we've got time to get that clarification. But the key thing that we're saying to employers is make sure that you keep separate records in your payroll of what is JobKeeper payment and what is what the person would normally be paid. That means that whatever answers we get in relation to workers' compensation and potentially payroll tax as well, you'll have the information easily gathered to enable you to do that declaration. But also, from our perspective as a representative organisation, if it seems that they're getting an unfair or unintended consequences, it will be really helpful if we're able to use real data about what extra it's costing businesses in that space. So we have fact sheets on our COVID page, one which looks at premium, and that we are updating that as we get extra information about what each of the jurisdictions is doing with premium. And once we get more insight into what they're doing around weekly compensation, we'll update those as well. Pardon me. So do keep an eye on those to understand what's going on. And if you are getting conflicting or confusing or unclear advice from your agents or insurers, please feed that back through to us so that we can consolidate that information and share it back through our policy space as well. So they're the key workers' comp issues at the moment. What I'd like to move on to now is the next slide, which is looking at a title that I've referred to as Beyond Stage 3 Restrictions. We don't know what it's going to be called, and we don't completely know what it's going to look like, but we do know that everyone is now turning their mind to it. And so we were part of contributing to some safe workplace principles that Mark mentioned before, that were released by National Cabinet last Friday. The full list of principles, there's 10 of them, can be found at this link. But what I wanted to do was just pull out some of the key considerations. But one of the things these principles are trying to do is get businesses and workers and really everyone involved in the workplace to understand that as restrictions are lifted, it's not about saying we can go back to normal. And there are some key things that we need to make sure that we're doing in this space. One of the key dot points is the importance of consultation, and I'll mention that a few times today. Consultation's a legislative obligation when it comes to health and safety anyway. We have an obligation to consult with workers in quantifying our risks, implementing controls and reviewing them. But one of the key things about COVID, which in some ways is different to some of our other health and safety issues, is that it's not just a workplace issue, it's a public health issue. There's a whole lot of things that we're going to be asking people to do in our workplaces, which we need them to understand and comply and be part of identifying what the issues are. So in our messaging of take this slowly and make sure you're ready to change your workplaces, it gives people time to have appropriate levels of consultation to make sure we get the right outcomes and to make sure that people understand the issues so that hopefully some of those responses that we're getting through the ACTU research now will change if there's a greater understanding of why things are being done in workplaces. There's a really strong focus in the principles around the importance of having safe work practices that are in line with what the health authorities are recommending, and also continuing to maintain social distancing and exemplary hygiene measures. And the Department of Health guidance helps us with that, and I will talk a little bit more about social distancing in a moment. There's also a recognition, though, that whilst we've done a really good job at flattening the curve across Australia and reducing our new cases, as restrictions are lifted, there is a high risk that we will have outbreaks. So businesses and workers still need to concentrate actively on controlling against transmission and preparing for the possibility that there will be cases and be ready to respond. And a key resource that has been set up as part of this process is Safe Work Australia, having a central hub of resources. They are liaising with all of the jurisdictions and with social partners, and AI Group is a member of Safe Work Australia, so we've been in the centre of this process to make sure that we can have guidance, one point of truth, for want of a better terminology, that people can access to understand what it is that we need to be doing in getting our businesses operating as close to normal as possible while still making sure we reduce the risk of COVID-19 outbreaks. So with that in mind, if we look at the next slide, when we look at social distancing in workplaces, whilst we've been talking about this now for a long time, and if you, I'm sure, are talking to your family or friends, there's this general recognition that social distancing is about keeping 1.5 metres away from somebody. And that's become a very common understanding. All jurisdictions have got laws in place at the moment to ensure closures of specific venues, but also to establish the social distancing requirements. And those jurisdictions, the legislation, of course, varies across jurisdictions, but there is a lot of similarity. If you were looking at exactly what you need to do in your workplaces, you absolutely need to go to the detail of the jurisdiction that you're considering. But from a general perspective, many of the jurisdictions, when they say you have to have social distancing in place, are excluding a number of groups, including a dot point which says an office building, factory, mine or construction site for its normal business or operation. And this is probably for two reasons: recognising that there's some work that just can't get social distancing and still doing the work, but also recognising that when things are happening in workplaces, we know who's there. We're not having hundreds of people walk through the supermarket every day we're actually controlling who is coming and going. But the guidelines, as they are legislated before we look at these restrictions, talk about having 1.5 metres between people and ensuring 4 square metres per person. So that's why in supermarkets, chemists, a number of other stores that you will have visited over the last few weeks are controlling the number of people that go into the store. And that's to enable them to maintain their 4 square metres distance. And some coverage of in the Financial Review, following the release of the Safe Workplace Principles, said that social distancing in workplaces was required to be the 4 square metres and the 1.5 metres between people. The Australian government guidance is saying that's what you should try to achieve, recognising that it's not actually specified in the legislation of most jurisdictions. So that's what people are expecting. That's what some of the media will be talking about. So when we're looking at going back to work, we do need to absolutely see what we can do, particularly to achieve the 1.5 metre distance, but also to achieve the 4 square metres if we can. If we can't achieve those, then I think it's really important that we have the conversations, going back to that consultation piece, the conversations with workers about this is what we're legally required to do, this is what we're trying to achieve, what ideas have you got to help us achieve this? And some of that might be about some people coming back into the office for a few days while others come back on another day, but having those conversations and making sure people understand what the legal obligations are and what the things are that we're really trying to do. So moving on to a bit of an illustration on the next slide of how some of these pieces fit together. But I want to start off with responding to COVID-19 is different, but the same to any other health and safety issue we're dealing with in our workplace. Where it is the same is that we have to apply the hierarchy of controls. We have to eliminate or minimise risk so far as is reasonably practicable. And in looking at that, what that means is we've got to eliminate risk where we can. If we can't eliminate them, we've got to look at controls like substitution, engineering controls and isolation controls. If we can't use those, that's when we can rely on administrative controls and personal protective equipment. And that becomes one of the challenges for us because within this space, a lot of our controls, even after we set up processes which say people don't need to work within 1.5 metres of each other, we still need people to be prepared to comply with that, not just while they're at that workplace, but when they talk to the person next to them or go for their coffee break. So that process of having that in place is really important. So some of the stages that we really need to look through as we're going down this process of lifting restrictions, first of all, is our workplace fit to be re-inhabited? So some workplaces have been operating at reduced activity. If we're going to increase that activity, is there some preventative maintenance we need to do on plant before we go back up to full speed of an operation, for example? If we've had an office space completely shut down, we really need to have an advance party who goes in and looks at things like, are the toilets working? Have we got hot water? Can we turn the heating on? But you might have some other issues. AI Group had one of our offices broken into a few weeks during this shutdown, equipment ripped out of the walls. So before we can have people go back into that workplace, we actually have to get an electrician to go in to look at what remediation needs to happen there to make sure that the workplace is safe. So don't just presume that how you shut your offices 6 weeks ago is how they're going to look when they reopen. We want to make sure that we're encouraging people to maintain their protocols outside of work. There is a risk that people will overcompensate for being locked down. So being part of that process of reminding people about those protocols is important. And to do that in the context of it's protecting themselves, it's protecting their fellow workers, it's protecting their family, and it's protecting the business and income. Because if we do have spikes in COVID-19, then businesses or parts of businesses might have to close when they've only just started to operate again. We also need to think about organisations that have operated during stage 3 restrictions. You might think because you've operated during those restrictions that there's nothing you need to think about as the restrictions are lifted. But the reality is, if you've only had half of your workplace operating, they might have developed some really good protocols in the workplace. And when your engineers and office workers come back, they might be at a risk of actually damaging all of that for you. So you really do need to think about those sorts of impacts as well. We want to make sure people stay at home if they're unwell. We do have the increased testing protocols, which may have an impact on that as well. But if we think about, it's not just in relation necessarily just to COVID, but it's about people's anxiety about being back at work. And if we do have a situation where we've got somebody coughing and spluttering in the workplace, even if they've tested negative to COVID, it's probably not going to create a very comfortable environment. So that's another thing we need to think about. We've got this wording in here about creating work-related bubbles, and the terminology of bubbles has come out of New Zealand, really, where there's been a lot of talk about establishing your bubbles, know who's in them, and that way you're reducing your infection possibility, particularly if your bubbles are small. But also, if there is an infection, you know who was in that bubble and you know who may have to be isolated or tested. So thinking of that in the work-related space, particularly in the initial stages of returning with restrictions being lifted, we want to think about work-related bubbles. So who is it in our workplace who are going to be interacting together as part of their work? And how do we make sure that we don't have those bubbles overlapping so much that if we have a COVID-19 exposure, we say, well, it's possible that everybody in this particular office could have been exposed, rather than being able to say, we know that there's 10 people who've had close interaction and they've had no interaction with anyone else. So you might want to consider whether they are organisational bubbles, but that's probably something that is really important to think about. If we did have to self-isolate, if we did have to shut down part of our business, would it make sense for all of our accountants to have to be sent home? So maybe there needs to be some reorganisation in the workplace about, instead of sitting in your natural groups of people who have the same talent, that you might actually split those groups up and create cross-sectional groups of people who are sitting together who are part of that bubble. And then also thinking about the social teams. So all organisations have got groups of people who mix socially, who don't work together. How do we identify what that means and whether we're going to allow those social groupings to actually operate? It's going to be much better to identify ahead that we've got a social grouping that we want to talk to and say, we need you to not be outside of your bubbles. Happy for you to keep communicating, use Microsoft Teams still, use Zoom, use phones, everything, but please don't congregate together in the lunchroom. Social distancing, we've already touched on. Hygiene protocols will be really, really crucial. Another important thing is going to be contact records. And the better we are at controlling our bubbles, the easier it will be to have contact records about who has been in contact with whom. So if there is a COVID-19 breakout, we know who we need to isolate. Make sure, and it seems like a really simple thing to say, but make sure you've got current contact details of all of your workers. It's really difficult sometimes to keep those up to date, and it's really important when you've got people back to work. If you do need to contact them and say you need to self-isolate, you don't want to find that you've got an out-of-date phone number for them. And that links into response plans. What are we going to do if we do have an outbreak? One of the areas where we know we're going to get issues, and they'll be at two extremes, is people who are currently working from home. And so we know we've had a large part of our workforce have got people working from home. For some people, that's been an incredibly successful transition. They're loving it. Save 2 hours travel, getting to and from work, all those sorts of things. For a number of other people, it has been incredibly stressful. People who are trying to work with families around homeschooling, people who live on their own. And so we are going to have to think about what does that actually mean as we head back into the workplace, and to make sure that we control what occurs when people say, fantastic restrictions have been lifted, I want to go back to work. Because we really need to make sure that we've done a full assessment of everything that we need to consider before we say to people, yes, you can come back into the office. So we've got to have the consultation We've got to know what we need to do around cleaning, self-isolation, social distancing. We're going to need to have induction, training, a whole range of things to make sure that when people move back into the workplace, that we do have appropriate controls for it. And for people who have successfully transitioned to being at home and maybe are now able to work without phones, without noise, without distraction, they might actually really struggle to transfer back into the workplace. So there are all the sorts of considerations we need to have, and Michael will touch on some of the workplace relations issues that are in that space. So if we then look at the whole implementation process of, on the next slide, where we've got a number of images here: consulting, communicating, informing, training, reinforcing and supervising. They're all things that are going to be crucial. I cannot emphasise enough the importance of consulting with workers about how we're going to meet our COVID-19 control measures and communicating about, now that we've consulted, this is what we've decided and these are the reasons why we've decided. Never before has it been more important to be able to have open communications with our workers about what is actually working for them. So a starting point in that consultation space is talking to the people who have stayed at work. What's worked for them? What needs to be changed? And what are they concerned about as other people are coming back into the workplace? Because they will have established protocols and processes that hopefully they're comfortable with, and we don't want that to be damaged either in reality by increasing the exposure to COVID-19 or by people's perception that out here in the factory we've done a really good job of keeping things under control, and now we've got all these managers and engineers and office people coming back, they're getting in the way, they're interfering with our systems, and we're really worried that they're actually going to cause harm in the workplace. For those that are returning to the workplace, I've already talked about the extremes that we're likely to have for those that are outside. It's going to be really helpful to understand which cohort each of your workers fits into. And hopefully the conversations and discussions that managers have been having with workers who have been working from home over the last few weeks, you should have a pretty good insight into that. But it's a way of identifying who you might need to get back to work quickly. People who are feeling socially isolated, people who may be at risk of domestic violence, which has been heightened by being in the workplace. Can we help them by getting them back to the workplace more easily? And for those that are comfortable working at home at the moment, we probably don't want to give them an expectation that it's a forever option, but at least give them the opportunity to say, well, I suppose in saying to them, we've got a whole lot of people who are really keen to get back to work. Your willingness to not come back into the office straight away is helpful, but we will be expecting you to be back in the office at some time in the future. Asking people what they think might be issues in the workplace for social distancing, cleaning and hygiene is also important. There's a whole lot of things that we can probably think of thinking about our workplaces, but there are going to be individual sensitivities that people have around a range of things, which might be as simple as we've got a coffee machine that's got skim milk and full cream milk, and when people change the connection over, are they creating a COVID-19 risk? And the answer might be yes, and the answer might be, well, we're not going to have the coffee machines running for the next 6 weeks. So it's really some very micro things that we need to think about and get people to tell us what those issues are. How are we going to help them to transition back into the workplace? And how do we adapt our teams? So certainly within AI Group, everyone has got used to communicating via Microsoft Teams, lots of team conversations. It's become a very normal way of doing work. If we have half of our staff back in the office and half of our staff at home, even if that's on an alternating space, how do we make sure that we continue to keep a team cohesion and we don't actually end up with splitting into two separate teams, the people who are in the office and the people who are at home? So working out how we do that transition effectively. Training on control measures, induction into control measures, and management being present to reinforce those control measures is really important, and giving people the skill to be able to say, that person's stepping into my space, I'm not comfortable, and I know how to talk to that person about why I want them to take a step back and give me my 1.5 metre distance. In the end, our leaders need to show leadership in our workplaces about how this is going to work and really be prepared to listen to people's concerns. Going back again to that mental health risk that we have with COVID, it doesn't matter how trivial somebody's concern might be to us in hearing about it. If it's important to them, we have to give it credence and we have to address it, or we are likely to have mental health issues coming out of that. We may not always get the solution, but having the conversation and the explanation about how we can resolve it collectively will be helpful. I now want to move on and look at some hot topics about COVID-19 that have come up over the last few weeks. First one is about how much cleaning is the right amount of cleaning. So on the next slide, you'll see one of the issues is more cleaning is not necessarily better cleaning. We've got to make sure that we are targeted with the cleaning, that we are focusing on high traffic and high contact areas. Safe Work Australia is currently finalising some very detailed information about cleaning, which we encourage people to access. Make sure your people understand why you're making the decisions about cleaning and consult with them and communicate with them around that. And remember that cleaning products are going to be in high demand. So the indiscriminate overuse of cleaning products might actually lead to a situation where you can't do the cleaning that you really need to do. So it is a bit of a balance about making sure we've got the appropriate cleaning in place and not going overboard with it. The next hot topic, not meaning a pun, is around temperature testing. And we've got the authorities who are split on the value of temperature testing in general workplaces. One of the issues that we have is that an elevated temperature doesn't mean that the person has got COVID-19. It could be a range of other things. If it turns out that it is COVID-19, because people are usually asymptomatic, they've probably been in the workplace for a couple of days anyway. And the fact that somebody doesn't have a temperature doesn't mean that they don't have COVID. So really what we're looking at is, yes, it is a screening process, but if people become complacent and say, we don't have elevated temperatures, therefore it's not an issue for our other controls, we will have major issues there. And we also have a number of people identifying issues that temperature testing may actually increase the risk, both to the people who are being tested and to the people who are doing the testing. So if you are going to have testing processes in place, it needs to be a reliable regime. It needs to be done in a way that it doesn't increase the risk of COVID transmission in the workplace. And you need to make sure that you've consulted with your workers and talk to them about what the testing's achieving and what it's not achieving. The use of masks is probably one of the most controversial of the issues that is arising. And I've had members ask me already, if we go back into the workplace, into an office environment, how do we make sure we've got the masks we need to protect everybody? I would have thought if you were going into an environment in an office where that was your expected control, you might be too soon to be going back into the office. The World Health Organization is not supporting the use of masks in the normal work environment. They're saying that if you're healthy, you only need to wear a mask if you are taking care of a person with COVID-19. To wear a mask if you're coughing or sneezing, but in the workplace environment, we really don't want those people at work anyway. If masks are being used, they're only effective if they're used in combination with frequent hand cleaning and with alcohol-based hand rub or soap. And if masks are used and they are not taken off and disposed of effectively, then potentially they're going to increase the risk of COVID being shared around the workplace. So if people believe they need masks, and there's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of controversy and there are people who are saying everyone should be wearing masks in public. It really is important, once again, to have the consultation, the communication about whether we do need them or we don't, and if not, why they aren't being supplied. The final hot topic, which has really only come out over the last couple of days, is the impact of increased testing. A number of jurisdictions have announced they want to significantly increase their testing. New South Wales is doing it on a hotspot location. Victoria's doing it based on organisations and industries that have continued to operate during the height of COVID. So we may get some spikes. What we need to know is what we're going to do in our organisations if we get those spikes. And that's another reason why we need to respond. We may not get an increased occurrence of COVID in the community, but we might get an increased occurrence of identification. So just moving on to some final thoughts on health and safety risks and controls. If we go to the next slide, a word of warning and patience. If your current arrangements have been working for weeks or months, don't be in a hurry to change them unless you know that you can confidently do it while minimising the risk. Consult, plan, monitor and review and get it right, and be prepared to respond and change if you find that things aren't working the way that you expected to. Just because you've got everyone back into the office on Monday, it doesn't mean they still have to be there on Tuesday if you've identified on Monday that, hey, this isn't going to work. And another issue unrelated to COVID is the importance of not forgetting your normal risks. I was in a meeting with senior people from WorkSafe Victoria last week where they made the comment that people are still getting injured in exactly the way they got injured before we had COVID-19. And so whilst we're focusing on COVID, we've got to make sure we continue to move on. And that takes me to my last slide, which is just some resources, which I will get us to just skip over there. They're there for you to have a reference to at a later point. And what I'd like to do now is pass on to Michael.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Look, the stuff that I wanted to cover today is really from a workplace relations and employee relations perspective, thinking about moving back into getting back to business context. And look, a number of the themes that I'll talk about are similar to the themes that Tracy covered in terms of good communication and good consultation with your employees, and really understanding that they're operating in a different paradigm in circumstances where employees may need to have experienced some significant change to their working conditions, and those disruptions necessarily can create certain impediments or ruptures in the way in which businesses would usually operate and the way in which employees might ordinarily conduct themselves. Now, as you would all be aware, or many of you will be aware, there are so many businesses that have had to deploy what are significant changes to their operations, whether it's reduction in hours, variation to the way in which work may be performed, either from a working from home context or in some cases splitting shifts or segmentation of work teams. There are circumstances where businesses have had to face into redundancy situations and stand downs, and all of these things are fertile ground, obviously, for discontent and disquiet amongst a work group, and can create a range of potential employee relations issues, not only with the way in which employees might interact with one another, but quite clearly also the way in which they might interact with management and leaders within the business. Look, one of the interesting things that some businesses are also reflecting back to us that they're experiencing is that now that the initial first wave of crisis management has been, written out, that there are some modifications in behaviour that they're experiencing, or getting some discussion and discourse from employees, essentially seeking quid pro quo arrangements and essentially identifying that in a context in which they may have lent into particular operational changes, now that the duration and extent and impact of some of those changes may have been felt for an extended period, that employees' perspectives on some of these things may start to shift. So it's important to be live to that and understand what strategies you might be prepared to deploy in order to keep employee engagement up and make sure that you can stay the course on some of those key operational changes. Now, just moving to the next slide, because one of the things that Tracy identified, and it's a useful talking point in relation to temperature checking, the question of what to do if someone is operating with an elevated temperature. Now, look, as a starting proposition, I think, whilst businesses need to make decisions about the practicality of engaging in temperature testing as one of their risk management steps, from a legal proposition, you as an employer have the right to direct your employees to undertake activities that are reasonable and lawful. And in relation to access to your site by contractors or visitors, once again, you're entitled to establish appropriate protocols and procedures in relation to that access. So the starting position is that should you decide to deploy such an arrangement, there's no prima facie prohibition against it. But I think you need to then understand and really think about, well, what are you going to be doing in a context when an employee does have an elevated temperature? One of the obvious things to need to consider is how does any direction you might give to an employee to remove themselves from the workplace engage with personal leave obligations. And relevantly in that regard, as Tracy's identified, just because someone has an elevated temperature doesn't mean that they're positive for COVID. Indeed, it doesn't necessarily even mean that they are unwell or unfit. So there's no automatic triggering of personal leave entitlements in that context. It's a question of whether the employee is not fit for work because of personal illness or injury. And one of the steps that you might choose to take is suggest to the employee that they go to see their nominated medical practitioner to determine whether in fact there is a illness there that needs to be treated. And if so, obviously then that would allow them to access paid personal leave under the NES, subject to the appropriate notice and evidence requirements. Look, assuming that it's not a personal leave scenario or the employee resists accessing their medical practitioner to get a diagnosis, there are questions that arise in relation to accessing of other leave. And indeed, employers, when we were dealing with circumstances around mandatory self-isolation or presumptive self-isolation, there were questions that arose as to what the appropriate leave entitlements might be to access those absences or to support those absences. Whether there's a right to receive payment more generally is a question that arises in the context of whether the employee is ready, willing and able to perform work. So if the employee isn't prepared to agree to access their leave entitlements, and indeed there is no personal leave entitlement that they are drawing down on, the prima facie position would be that where you're directing the employee to remain away from the workplace because you have a concern about their elevated temperature, there wouldn't be ordinarily the ability to withhold payment for that day or period because it's you that are asking them to withdraw themselves from the workplace under your direction. There are also questions about medical certification as well in terms of the return to work. And broadly, I know that there was a lot that was distributed both by the government and the AMA in terms of resisting employers seeking mandatory medical certification before returning back to work if they'd been absent or self-isolating for any period. And that was principally to remove the strain on the medical system in relation to cases and elevated cases of COVID. So these are all things that you need to think about in terms of how you want to move through your own implementation of a process like this and what it might mean for managing your ongoing workplace risks and employee-related issues. Now, just moving to the next slide, a number of the propositions that are on the next few slides are fairly self-evident, so I won't spend a great deal of time talking about them. And once again, they pick up on themes that Tracy has already identified, which is that I think you need to understand, and indeed many of you probably do, that the context in which we're operating is a very unusual set of circumstances that employees have had to endure. Not only are there concerns that they may be experiencing in terms of things like job security and financial security, but the macro conditions concerned with the external health crisis and things that might also be going on in their own households in terms of job security questions create heightened levels potentially of anxiety, tension that might manifest themselves in the workplace. So in terms of understanding those issues and then dealing with them from an appropriate management perspective, whilst I'm not saying for a second that we shouldn't call out bad behaviour when we see it, manage performance as it is appropriate, equally we need to understand that there are lots of things operating in the current paradigm, in the current mix, and that people's behaviours might not be what we would usually expect from them. Now, things also like feelings of inequity and unfairness, if there have been employees that have been issued with JobKeeper enabling directions, or if they've been working from home and there's only a partial transition back to the workplace in circumstances where they might desperately want to return, if there's been redundancies or stand-downs in the workplace, all of these things feed into the mixing pot of conditions that might create different and more complex employee relations issues for you need to manage. And it's sensible for you to be sensitive to those issues and to manage them in a way that is not harsh, unjust or unreasonable as you work through how you might deal with employees' ongoing employment through these circumstances. Now, just some tips for managing the return to work, in addition to the ones that Tracy's identified. From my perspective, you need to clearly have an eye to the identified safety risks. So if we could just move to the next slide. But we also need to be thinking about the operational disruptions, many of which Tracy's also has already highlighted. So things like having separated work groups, not only from an operational perspective, but also from a social perspective, and how that might impact workplace culture and impact the way in which people might behave and then interact with the broader workforce. Being sensitive and live to these things is quite important. Now, I think the clearest and best way to try to manage some of these very pertinent and obvious issues is through clear communication of expectations. You need to be managing performance and conduct issues in the usual way, investigating any concerns you have in terms of behavioural deviations from what would be the standard. And it's also important that, and we'll deal with this if we just move to the next slide, that as you think about returning to the workplace, quite clearly knowing your rights and obligations is key. So understanding that you as an employer have rights to introduce new policies and procedures and to manage according to those directions and rules is pivotal. Now, making sure your policies and procedures are appropriately drafted and well communicated will give you the best opportunity to be able to rely on those directions in circumstances where employees may not comply. It also will allow you to hopefully have the greatest traction in terms of ensuring that the behavioural changes that you might need, even for a short term, to manage some of the clear and present risks from a return to work in a COVID context, are being deployed and adhered to by your employee group. Look, understanding the JobKeeper rights and obligations, and appreciate that this is in a specific presentation concerning JobKeeper. AI Group has produced a vast array of literature and member advices in terms of the scope and breadth of JobKeeper, and we'll continue to talk to you about those issues as they develop and emerge. But understanding the options that you have as an employee in terms of JobKeeper enabling directions to reduce work, to change duties, to change locations of work, all of those things will be relevant as you think about how to get an effective return to work arrangement for your business. And finally, in terms of the rights and obligations, it's important to have an eye to not only the award system, and there are a range of awards that have had COVID-related award variations inserted into them. So the manufacturing award, the clerical award, a vast array of awards have had these variations introduced at short notice. So understanding what they mean and how they might impact the business is very, very important. But also understanding the operation of your enterprise agreements, and that you may have opportunities to explore variations to enterprise agreements with a COVID schedule or something like that in circumstances where the particular terms of your agreement may not meet your operational needs. Now, of course, we would suggest that if you're considering and exploring those issues, not only do you need to consult with your workforce, but consult with union representatives to the extent that you have them in your business as well. Businesses, I think, and Mark mentioned this, need to be very careful, because I think everyone's looking at what the next step is that employers might take as they get their employees back to work. Being cautious to make sure that we're not overreaching in relation to any of the deploying of changes to mitigate the impacts of the COVID crisis will be very, very important. And opening up conversations with employee representatives, consultative committees and union representatives where they might exist in your workplace just gives an opportunity to have a better quality conversation, and also to manage that communication a little bit more effectively, so that hopefully it's not perceived that you're trying to take advantage out of a health crisis such as this one. Now, obviously, please feel free to access our workplace advice line, or anyone at AI Group Workplace Lawyers, so the area of the business that I support and lead. We're all too happy to provide whatever assistance we can as you start to think through some of these issues, because there will be a range of complexities that potentially emerge as a result of either things that are happening in the external environment or within your business specifically. So anything we can do to assist, we're more than happy to do so. I think we're almost at time, Mark, so it might be appropriate to see if there are some questions that we can move through. There's been a fair few that have come through over the course of today's session, but as Mark said at the outset, if we can't get to all of your questions today, what we'll do is we'll do our best to respond to them over the next 24 to 48 hours through an email response. So Mark, I just might pass to you to, I guess, host us through the various questions that we've received over the course of the last hour.
Thanks, Michael. If people need to go because we have reached time, then apologise for that, but we will just extend for a few minutes to try and deal with a couple of questions. One for Tracy, and this has occurred to a few of us who are keen students of workers' compensation, is does this COVID experience mean that in the future work cover may be used to cover normal flu cases?
There's certainly been some speculation about that. The reality of things like flu is, and this was a lot of the discussions we had right up front around this, is that if you have something which is very common within the general community, then it's unlikely to become something that you would have as a work-related workers' compensation claim, unless there were specific reasons why you might be being exposed to it, like, for example, maybe in the health industry. But we certainly wouldn't expect that the flu, gastro, any of those other sorts of diseases would end up in the workers' comp scheme. But it may, time will tell whether it changes people's claiming behaviour having been through COVID.
Thanks, Tracy. Michael, one for you. If companies had a lot of employees working from home, is that going to make it difficult after COVID to decline a request for working from home?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I think obviously in terms of the circumstances that have presented themselves now, businesses have needed to make immediate and urgent adjustments to try and manage the health risk. I think what we're finding is a lot of businesses are trying to assess the benefits of the changes that they've needed to implement and sensibly try to hold on and maximise as many of those benefits as possible. I don't necessarily think it follows absolutely that just because we've managed to work successfully, or rather deployed a work from home arrangement in the current context as a necessary response to this external health crisis, that employers would need to, in absolute, grant any prospective request. I think they can still be dealt with based on an understanding of the future operational needs and considering any disruptions or impacts that might have occurred as a result of the existing working from home arrangements. But I think it would be very sensible, and indeed many of our members are already doing this, to think about what are those benefits that have existed as a result of operating in the new context, in the new paradigm, and putting aside older historical prejudices about whether in fact jobs could effectively be done from home. I know that we found it has been very effective for us in a circumstance where historically we've worked very closely together in the same geographical space. So I'd hope that employers think about that. I think it's a sensible step moving forward.
Thanks, Michael. And one question perhaps that both of you might want to answer, it's in two parts. If an employee is showing symptoms, should the employer be insisting on them undertaking a test? And if a visitor, a contractor or someone like that to the site is also, you have some doubt about their health, what rights do you have to exclude them entry? Perhaps starting with you, Tracy, on the first one.
I suppose starting on the issue of encouraging a worker to have the test would be an appropriate thing. I think it's really Michael's answer as to whether or not it is something that you can compel someone to do.
Yeah. So I'd have reservations about setting a blanket rule about compelling people to undertake a test. I think it intersects with questions about what's reasonable and lawful in a particular context. I think, as we've said before, there are certain symptoms that may not be reflective of any particular illness or injury. So understanding the particular circumstances and the risks that you're purporting to manage in your specific operations, I think is what is the key issue. So I'd be reluctant to advise anyone that we can start establishing some blanket rules for testing in those contexts.
Tracy, is there a website that has good information on applying hygiene in industrial settings? And related question about advice on how you make it work in construction, particularly where construction workers need to work close to each other. Should they be wearing masks or other PPE if they can't avoid working close to 1.5? But more broadly, are there good resources now targeted at individual sectors?
Bit of a triple-barreled question there. I hope I capture all of it. Certainly, this is the sort of material that Safe Work Australia is in the process of finalising, particularly around cleaning. Personal hygiene is relatively straightforward. Wash your hands at all the appropriate times, and there's lots of general health information around that. In relation to the construction industry, some jurisdictions have been working very closely with their construction partners, both employers and unions, around establishing reasonable controls, recognising that 1.5 metres is about what we should be trying to achieve. And I know that in the Victorian context, there was a lot of discussion about how did they achieve appropriate controls in a hoist going up to a high-rise building, which would normally be packed tight with people. They're only in it for 3 or 4 minutes. And I can't say I've got the answer off the top of my head, but I know there was information there that came down to have as few people as possible, but we recognise it's not about having just one person in the hoist at once. The 1.5 metres, when you look at things like contact tracing, they're talking about 1.5 metres for 15 minutes. And so if you have particular industries, particularly construction, because that was a major focus for a lot of the discussion, do have a look at your local jurisdiction. As I said, I know Victoria has just released materials, and it's one of the areas that Safe Work Australia has been working on as well. But if you have a particular question about construction, feel free to send me an email, and I can send you links to the information we've got access to.
Thanks, Tracy. Just returning to an earlier question that Michael answered, it was unfairly a double-barreled question as well. And the second part of it was about visitors, but I think companies have pretty strong rights to exclude visitors if they have reasonable grounds.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I just, as Tracy was talking, I realised that I missed the second barrel of that question. So yeah, I absolutely agree. I think I might have mentioned it earlier in the slides that as a business, you can set whatever protocols you determine are appropriate and reasonable in terms of managing access to your site for visitors and contractors. So if the determination was that people that are symptomatic should not be given access, or individuals with an elevated temperature, then there's nothing unreasonable or unlawful about that from a contractor management or visitor management perspective.
Thanks, Michael. And there's one final question about should companies require employees to record any incidents of close contact while at work for contract tracing purposes? I think your presentation earlier, Tracy, made the point that workplaces are a great place to record contact, and that should be part of the new normal for the foreseeable future. So that if you do have, and we know this from experience with companies that have had a positive case, it doesn't automatically shut the companies down in most cases, but they do want to know who was that person in close contact with, and therefore which of the employees might be excluded from the workplace in isolation for a period of time, to both for their protection and for infection control, but also so that the company can keep operating. So the answer to that is yes. It's good to have a very good handle on who your employees are in close contact with while they are at work, and check that that's actually the way it works. Some companies find that the way they think their factory operates isn't the way it really operates. But if you've got a good handle on that, then you can aid the public health effort at the same time as protect the business from a total close down if you have a positive case. We might bring things to a close there and just move on to the final slide, which is a reminder that we have all this advice and a lot more on a dedicated part of our webpage for the coronavirus resources, including links to future webinars and other resources, as well as the advice we have been given and are regularly updating. So please make use of that, and please give us any feedback. There's more information that you need. And finally, moving on, thank you for your participation. Sorry we went a little bit over, but it's really important time to engage with you. There will be a copy of the presentation made available in the next 24 hours as soon as possible, and we will try and get back to anyone's question that wasn't answered. Can I finally say thank you very much for your support of AI Group. We've been very busy, but not nearly as disrupted as our members obviously have been. We really appreciate the support that you've given us so that we can give you the support in return and act as a real link with government on all these issues and a lot more. So thank you. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and please stay safe.